The rain poured down in heavy sheets that night, the kind that drowns out whispers and washes away footprints. Grace Baptist Church stood tall against the storm, its steeple piercing the night sky like a jagged spear. Inside its walls, Pastor Williams knelt alone at the altar, his hands clasped tightly, eyes shut against the flickering glow of candlelight. His whispers were lost beneath the roar of thunder, but anyone close enough might have heard the same words, over and over. Bring her back, bring her back. Sarah Williams had been missing for 3 days. Her absence hung over the community like thick fog, choking the air with anxiety and unanswered questions. She was a fixture in Grace Baptist, as much a part of the church as the stained glass windows or the wooden pews. Always the first to arrive for Sunday service, always the last to leave, her laugh warm and infectious. When she didn't show up for the Wednesday prayer meeting, people noticed. When she missed choir rehearsal on Thursday, they began to whisper. And by Sunday, when the pulpit stood bare of her familiar presence, the whispers turned to alarm. Pastor Williams played his role well. Eyes rimmed red with sleeplessness, hands shaking slightly as he held the good book and spoke of faith amidst tribulation. His voice cracked on Sarah's name, a perfect tremor of sorrow that drew the congregation closer, clasping hands and bowing heads in solemn prayer. But there were things that didn't fit, things that simmered just beneath the surface of his grief, like stones hidden in shallow water. There were murmurs about that last Sunday sermon before Sarah disappeared. How Pastor Williams had been unusually distant, his words stumbling from his mouth as if dragged out unwillingly. How Sarah had left midway through the service, slipping out the side door with her face hidden behind dark glasses. How Deacon Marshall had followed just minutes later, his expression hard and unreadable. No one saw her after that. Not at the market, where she bought fresh bread every morning. Not at the community center, where she taught the women's Bible study. Not even on the narrow path winding up to the parsonage, where the lights burned late into the night. Pastor Williams had filed the missing person report with trembling hands, his voice cracking as he described the last time he saw her, smiling in their kitchen, the smell of cornbread filling the room. She'd kissed him on the cheek, he'd said, and stepped out to visit a friend. She never came back. The police searched, of course, door to door, questioning neighbors, scouring the nearby woods, dragging the lake behind the old mill. But they found nothing. Not a footprint. Not a scrap of fabric. Not even a stray hair. It was as if Sarah had been swallowed by the earth itself. And in time, the search slowed. The questions faded. The whispers turned to sighs and shaking heads. She had vanished, just another mystery, another name to be spoken with sad, knowing glances. Pastor Williams continued his sermons, his grief settling around him like a well-worn coat. He preached about faith and redemption, about the power of hope amidst despair. But some nights, long after the church doors had closed and the lights had been extinguished, he would kneel alone at the altar, whispering her name to the shadows, as if they might answer back. The community of Grace Baptist Church was tightly knit, woven together by decades of potlucks, Sunday services, and front porch gossip that drifted like smoke through the narrow streets of South Atlanta. Generations had walked the cracked sidewalks lined with magnolia trees and faded brick storefronts. The church sat at the heart of it all, a towering structure with whitewashed walls and stained glass windows that splashed rainbows onto the worn carpet each morning. It was more than a place of worship, it was the backbone of the community. When Sarah Williams vanished, the people rallied around Pastor Williams with the kind of loyalty that only deep-rooted faith could inspire. Women from the congregation filled his kitchen with casseroles and cornbread, setting plates down with gentle hands and murmuring words of comfort. Men clasped his shoulder at Sunday service, nodding silently, their eyes hard with unspoken promises of protection and prayer. But beneath the kindness lay something darker, a ripple of unease that spread with each passing day. Pastor Williams seemed to wear his grief like a second skin, taut and stretched too thin. His sermons grew heavier, laced with fire and brimstone, warnings of sin and redemption. He spoke of trials and the purging of evil, his eyes gleaming with fervor as he gripped the edges of the pulpit with white-knuckled hands. Congregants whispered to one another as they filed out of the church, their voices low and cautious. "He's hurting," they would say. "Grief does strange things." And then there was Deacon Marshall. His absence had gone largely unnoticed in the chaos of Sarah's disappearance, written off as another soul shaken by tragedy. But those who paid close attention remembered how he had been a constant presence beside Sarah in the weeks leading up to her vanishing. They had been seen working together on the church's charity events, their laughter drifting out from the rec hall, sometimes lingering just a bit too long after the meetings ended. When he stopped coming to church, most assumed he'd taken the loss hard. Pastor Williams said as much during one of his Sunday sermons, voice cracking as he asked the congregation to keep Deacon Marshall in their prayers. Still, the whispers grew. The women at the beauty parlor spoke in hushed tones, their hands frozen mid-curl as they recounted the last time they'd seen Sarah and Deacon Marshall together, standing too close in the church parking lot, voices low and heads bent. At the corner store, the clerk remembered Deacon Marshall buying flowers just days before Sarah went missing, yellow roses, her favorite. He'd smiled and paid in cash, the clerk recalled, humming a hymn under his breath as he walked out the door. But it was the pastor's grief that held the town's attention. His eyes, once bright with the light of Scripture, had grown hollow and shadowed. His hands shook slightly as he blessed the congregation, and his voice, though steady, seemed to waver just a bit too long on words like forgiveness and judgment. It was almost as if the weight of Sarah's absence clung to him like a heavy shroud, refusing to be shaken loose. In the quiet spaces between sermons and suppers, the whispers continued. Some said it was grief. Others thought it was something else entirely, something darker that swam beneath the surface of polite smiles and Sunday best. But whatever it was, it remained unspoken, caught in the corners of knowing eyes and the tight-lipped nods of those who dared to wonder. The renovations began on a brisk October morning, the kind that carried the first chill of winter through the streets of Atlanta. Grace Baptist Church had stood for nearly 70 years without so much as a fresh coat of paint on its aging walls. The cracked foundation and sagging beams were testament to time's relentless march, but Pastor Williams had insisted it was time to breathe new life into the house of God. He spoke of revival, of restoration, not just of the building, but of the community itself. Construction workers arrived in white vans, unloading crates of tools and stacks of lumber. Their footsteps echoed through the halls of the church as they tore up old carpets and stripped away layers of dust-laden wallpaper. Pastor Williams supervised the work with a fervor that bordered on obsession, his eyes watching each nail driven, and every beam lifted with a peculiar intensity. Some of the workers even joked among themselves that the pastor hovered like a man protecting secrets. But it was just small talk, the kind that filled long hours and empty spaces. It was during the excavation of the church basement that the secrets began to unravel. A backhoe tore into the packed dirt beneath the sanctuary, its metal claw scraping against something solid. Work halted, men murmuring in confusion as shovels replaced machinery, hands digging carefully around the object that had caught their attention. It was wrapped tightly in rotted fabric, the cloth disintegrating at their touch, crumbling like dead leaves in autumn. The workers stepped back as the foreman approached, his flashlight beam cutting through the dimness. His breath hung in the cool air as he crouched, peeling back the remnants of fabric with gloved hands. What he uncovered stole the air from the room. Bones, pale and brittle, curved out from the dirt like the ribs of a shipwreck. And there, still clinging to one of the skeletal fingers, was a gold band dulled by time and soil. The foreman staggered back, nearly tripping over a loose beam as he fumbled for his phone. The police were called. Detective Lane was the first to arrive, stepping out of his unmarked sedan with a notebook already in hand. He walked with the kind of deliberate calm that came from years of experience, eyes sharp and probing as he took in the scene. He spoke in low tones with the workers, his pen scratching against the page as he catalogued each detail. The ring was retrieved with care, placed in an evidence bag and photographed from every angle. Its engraving was still visible, despite the years spent buried under layers of dirt and stone. To Sarah, with all my love. Detective Lane's eyes flickered up to the looming shape of Grace Baptist Church, its steeple stretching into the overcast sky like a finger pointing toward judgment. His gaze settled on Pastor Williams, who had appeared on the church steps, hands clasped in front of him, face pale as ash. Lane studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to the ring, holding it up to the light. Beside it, still caked in dirt, was another gold band, its surface scratched and worn, but unmistakable. The engraving on that ring was simpler, just two letters intertwined, M and J, Deacon Marshall's initials. The excavation continued, shovels carving away the earth with grim determination. When the last layer of dirt was brushed away, the workers stepped back, hands shaking, eyes wide. Two skeletons lay side by side beneath the foundation of Grace Baptist Church, entwined as if in final, desperate embrace. The news of the discovery spread through the streets of Atlanta like wildfire. Morning headlines blared from every paper stand. Bodies found beneath Grace Baptist Church, one identified as pastor's missing wife. Television crews lined the sidewalks, their bright lights cutting through the early morning fog as reporters jostled for space in front of the church's towering entrance. Microphones crackled, voices carrying the same tremor of disbelief that gripped the entire community. Sarah Williams had been found, or what was left of her. 5 years of whispered prayers and unanswered questions buried beneath the very ground where Pastor Williams preached salvation every Sunday. But it wasn't just her body they found. The second ring, engraved with the initials M and J, had sent fresh waves of shock through the congregation. It was unmistakably Deacon Marshall's, a man who had also vanished 5 years ago without so much as a goodbye. His wife had claimed he'd left her for another woman, rumors swirling of infidelity and unpaid debts. The church had grieved, but not like they had for Sarah. His name had been quietly forgotten, slipped between pages of prayer lists and church bulletins. Detective Lane watched the scene unfold from the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, expression thoughtful. His eyes swept over the familiar faces gathered in clusters, hands wringing and eyes wide. There were those who wept openly, tears streaking down their cheeks as they clutched rosaries and whispered psalms. Others stood rigid, eyes narrow with suspicion, their gazes flickering toward Pastor Williams, who sat on the church steps, head bowed and hands trembling in his lap. Lane approached slowly, his shoes crunching against the gravel. He stopped a few feet away from the pastor, taking in the way Williams' shoulders shook with silent sobs, the way his fingers twisted around the hem of his jacket. It was a perfect display of grief, measured, restrained, yet raw enough to draw sympathy from the crowd. A woman stepped forward, laying a gentle hand on the pastor's shoulder, murmuring words of comfort. He looked up, eyes red and watery, nodding his thanks before dropping his gaze once more. But Lane wasn't convinced. Not yet. His instincts, honed by years of chasing ghosts and unraveling lies, prickled with something just out of reach. Pastor Williams' grief was precise, almost rehearsed. The shaking hands, the downcast eyes, it was all there, but there was a layer beneath it. Something lurking just under the surface, like rot beneath fresh paint. "Pastor Williams," Lane said finally, voice low and steady. The pastor didn't look up right away, his breath coming in ragged bursts before he finally raised his head. "I'm very sorry for your loss," Lane continued, his eyes fixed on the pastor's. "But I'd like to ask you a few questions if you're feeling up to it." Pastor Williams swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "Of course," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "Anything I can do to help." Lane nodded back, but his eyes remained sharp, unwavering. He motioned for the pastor to follow him to the side of the building, away from the prying eyes of the congregation. As they walked, Lane's mind raced with questions, each one knotting tighter than the last. 2 bodies beneath the church, one his wife, the other the missing deacon. A secret hidden beneath the pulpit for half a decade. And the pastor, his hands still shaking as he followed Lane's lead, his eyes darting nervously with each step. "Anything I can do to help," Pastor Williams had said. But Lane wondered, as he led the man around the corner, if Williams knew just how much he already had. Detective Lane was not a man easily shaken. 25 years on the force had taught him that behind every locked door and beneath every polished surface lay secrets waiting to be uncovered. But something about Grace Baptist Church unsettled him. It wasn't just the discovery of 2 skeletons entwined beneath the pulpit or the glimmer of gold bands that whispered of promises broken. It was the way the walls seemed to hum with something unspoken, a vibration just beyond the edge of hearing. He stood in the church basement, dust swirling in the weak light of a single swinging bulb. The floor had been ripped up in patches, revealing the packed dirt where the bodies had been found. Lane stepped closer, crouching down to brush his hand over the ground, feeling the grit of it beneath his fingertips. It wasn't fresh. No, this had been disturbed long ago, settled again with time. He traced the faint outline of where the bodies had lain, noting the careful placement, the neatness of it. This hadn't been a hurried burial. Someone had taken their time. Pastor Williams hovered nearby, his hands clasped together, eyes fixed on the remnants of the excavation. His lips moved in silent prayer, or maybe just in the rhythm of his own thoughts. Lane watched him closely, taking in the pastor's stiff shoulders and the way his eyes never quite settled on the disturbed ground. He seemed almost detached, like he was watching someone else's tragedy unfold. "So, Pastor," Lane began, his voice low and even, "you said you last saw Sarah 5 years ago. She stepped out to visit a friend and never came back. Is that right?" Williams blinked, his eyes snapping back to the detective. "That's right," he replied, his voice thin and brittle. We had dinner together. Cornbread greens. Her favorite. She was going to see, Mrs. Lattimore, I think. Yes, that's right. Said she wouldn't be long. Lane raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Lattimore? Because I spoke to her just this morning. She said she hadn't seen Sarah that night. In fact, she says she wasn't even home. The pastor's face paled, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. That can't be, he stammered. That's what she told me. Lane let the silence stretch, watching the way Pastor Williams' hands flexed and curled, the skin taut over his knuckles. And Deacon Marshall? Lane asked, almost casually. When was the last time you saw him? Pastor Williams straightened, his eyes sharpening with something that looked almost like defiance. Deacon Marshall left the church. Some disagreements with the direction of our ministry. I hadn't seen him for weeks before Sarah disappeared. Lane nodded slowly, tapping his pen against his notebook. Strange though, his wife never reported him missing. Said he was traveling for work, but she couldn't quite remember where. Funny thing, isn't it? How people just vanish like that. Pastor Williams swallowed hard, the sound loud in the silence of the basement. I don't know what to say, Detective. I don't, he trailed off, his eyes dropping to the floor. Lane watched him for a long moment before closing his notebook with a snap. Well, Pastor, I appreciate your time, he said smoothly. I'm sure you're as eager as I am to find out how your wife ended up under your own church. Pastor Williams looked up sharply, his eyes flaring with something sharp and bright before it vanished behind a mask of grief. He nodded stiffly, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his neck quivered. Lane didn't miss it. He never missed much. And as he walked back up the creaking steps of Grace Baptist, he felt the first coils of truth begin to unwind. The news trucks finally cleared out, and the congregation returned to their routines, tentative, cautious, like stepping back into a house that had been haunted. But the whispers grew louder. At the corner store, between sips of coffee and the crinkle of paper bags, neighbors speculated in low voices. The barbershop buzzed with theories, clippers humming over scalp as men leaned in close to share their suspicions. And at the Sunday service that followed, the pews were more crowded than they had been in years, packed shoulder to shoulder with eyes that glimmered with curiosity and unease. Pastor Williams stood at the pulpit, his voice steady, his eyes heavy with sorrow. He spoke of loss, of faith tested, of how God's plan was often hidden from mortal eyes. His words were well measured, perfectly punctuated with pauses that invited nods of agreement and murmurs of sympathy. But even as he preached redemption, his hands gripped the edges of the lectern so tightly that his knuckles blanched. He did not look to the empty space where Sarah used to sit, nor did he mention Deacon Marshall by name. Detective Lane sat in the back row, his hat pulled low, arms crossed over his chest. He watched with the cool detachment of a man accustomed to observing rather than participating. His eyes flickered over the congregation, noting the familiar faces, the devoted, the skeptical, the curious. But it was Pastor Williams that held his attention. The man was too calm, too composed. Lane had seen grief in all its shades, raw and unfiltered, masked by anger, soaked in denial, but this was something else. When the service ended, Lane lingered by the doorway, watching as congregants filed out in small knots, whispering behind cupped hands. He spotted Mrs. Lattimore, the woman Pastor Williams claimed Sarah had gone to visit the night she disappeared. She moved slowly, clutching her handbag with both hands, her wide-brimmed hat casting shadows over her eyes. Lane stepped forward, intercepting her just before she reached the church steps. Mrs. Lattimore, he began, his voice low and gentle. She stopped, blinking up at him through thick glasses. Detective Lane, he continued, offering a small smile. You mind if I ask you a few more questions about that night? The night Sarah disappeared. Mrs. Lattimore pursed her lips, her eyes flickering back toward the church. I already told you, Detective, she whispered. I didn't see her. She wasn't at my house. Lane nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. Right. But Pastor Williams said she was headed your way. Any idea why he might think that? She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the handle of her purse. I don't rightly know, she stammered. But I did see her a few days before. Lane raised an eyebrow. Oh. Mrs. Lattimore nodded, glancing around before leaning in closer. She was with Deacon Marshall, over at the food pantry. They were talking real close, whispering like. Lane's expression didn't change, but his pen moved swiftly in his notebook. Did it seem tense? He asked carefully. She hesitated, her eyes darting back to the church doors. No. It seemed friendly. Maybe too friendly. Her cheeks flushed as she said it, her gaze dropping to the cracked pavement beneath her feet. Lane straightened, slipping his notebook back into his coat pocket. "Thank you, Mrs. Lattimore. You've been very helpful." She gave him a thin smile and hurried off, her heels clicking against the concrete. Lane watched her go, his hands tucked into his pockets as he turned back to the towering facade of Grace Baptist Church. Whispers and secrets, wrapped in scripture and sealed with prayer. But even stone walls couldn't hold back the tide forever. And now, after 5 long years, the cracks were beginning to show. The whispers grew louder with each passing day. What had begun as murmurs at the beauty parlor and hushed conversations outside the corner store now flowed openly through the streets of South Atlanta. People spoke with their hands cupped around their mouths, leaning in close over picket fences and leaning back in barber chairs, voices dropping to conspiratorial whispers. Grace Baptist Church had become a beacon, not of faith, but of mystery. Detective Lane knew how rumors could poison a case. They twisted facts, warped perceptions, and sometimes even led to the wrong conclusions. But sometimes, just sometimes, they also hid kernels of truth. He spent his days combing through reports, interviewing anyone who had been close to Sarah or Deacon Marshall. The records from 5 years ago were sparse, just a thin stack of paper in a manila folder with missing persons stamped across the front in red ink. Sarah's photograph, eyes bright and smile wide, was clipped to the inside cover. Next to it, the familiar face of Deacon Marshall, his expression stern and unsmiling. Lane read the statements carefully. Most were simple, last seen at church, volunteering at the food drive, always smiling, always kind. But buried in the middle of the stack was a report from a church volunteer, dated 2 days before Sarah's disappearance. Heated argument in the parking lot, Pastor Williams and Deacon Marshall. Raised voices. Mention of money. The details were vague, the writing hurried and sloppy, but it was enough to make Lane sit up straighter. Money. That was new. Lane tapped his pen against the desk, his thoughts spiraling. He had asked about church finances during his initial rounds of questioning, but the records were clean. Donations, expenses, all accounted for. But that was the church's money. What about private accounts? Personal transactions? He picked up his phone, dialing the number for the local credit union. He didn't expect much. Privacy laws and bureaucracy usually tangled things up for weeks. But luck was on his side that day. "Detective Lane," the woman on the other end said after a long pause. "I do see a series of withdrawals. Significant ones, actually." His heartbeat quickened. How significant? Over $200,000, withdrawn in increments over the course of about 6 months. It stopped, let me see, just about 5 years ago. Lane scribbled furiously in his notebook, his pen pressing so hard it nearly tore the paper. "And whose account?" There was a long pause, the soft clicking of keys through the receiver. "The account is in the name of Deacon Marshall," she replied finally. "But the joint signer is Sarah Williams." Lane's hand froze, the pen hovering just above the page. His mind raced, images flashing like snapshots. Sarah slipping out of service early, Deacon Marshall following close behind, whispers in the food pantry, the rings buried side by side. He forced his voice to stay steady. "Thank you," he said, his tone clipped. "That's very helpful." He hung up the phone, his mind spinning with questions. $200,000. Withdrawn in secret. Sarah and Deacon Marshall, sharing not just whispers but finances. Lane closed his notebook and stood, the legs of his chair scraping against the worn linoleum. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows that crept over the sidewalks and curled around the steps of Grace Baptist. Lane watched as the shadows crawled up the church's whitewashed walls, stretching like fingers grasping for something hidden just out of reach. Secrets buried in the basement. Secrets hidden in plain sight. And Lane had a feeling that he had just uncovered the first thread in what would unravel everything. The church surveillance footage had been forgotten, buried under layers of dust and indifference in a back room no one bothered to check. Grace Baptist wasn't exactly known for its state-of-the-art technology. The security system had been installed years ago after a string of petty thefts in the neighborhood. 2 cameras outside, one in the main hall, and one tucked away in the basement near the storage room. No one had bothered to review the tapes after Sarah's disappearance. The police had called it a runaway case. No signs of struggle, no forced entry. Just a woman who had walked out one night and never came back. But Detective Lane wasn't satisfied with loose ends. He secured the necessary warrants, and after a morning of bureaucratic wrestling, the dusty boxes were carted out from the church's storage closet. They were heavier than he expected, the weight of time and neglect thick in the air as he set them down on the metal table in his office. He dusted off the first box and flipped it open, greeted by rows of tapes labeled with dates and little else. He began with the night Sarah disappeared. The tape clicked and whirred as it slid into the old machine, the screen flickering to life with grainy footage. At first, it was just shadows, trees swaying under the flicker of streetlights, the quiet stillness of midnight. Lane fast-forwarded, watching the hours tick by in silence. Midnight passed. 1 a.m. 2. And then just before 3 in the morning, movement. 2 figures emerged from the side door of the church, their forms hunched under the weight of heavy black garbage bags. Lane leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he watched the figures shuffle through the frame. The camera's resolution was poor, the faces little more than smudges in the dark, but the height difference was clear. One tall, broad-shouldered, the other shorter, slimmer. They moved with precision, each step careful and measured. Lane's fingers tapped the edge of the screen as he watched them navigate the narrow corridor along the side of the church, disappearing into the basement entrance. He rewound, eyes glued to the screen, slowing the footage to catch each step. The taller man paused before the basement door, his head turning slightly toward the camera, just for a moment. It was Pastor Williams. Even through the grainy quality of the tape, the outline of his face was unmistakable. Lane's jaw clenched, his fingers pausing mid-tap. He fast-forwarded, watching as the footage continued. 10 minutes later, the door opened again, but this time only one figure emerged. The shorter one, Deacon Marshall. He wiped his hands on his pants as he walked, head bowed, moving with hurried steps toward the back of the building. And then he was gone, slipping out of the camera's view as if swallowed by the night. Lane paused the tape, letting the image burn into his mind. 2 men. 2 garbage bags. One returns alone. He hit rewind, watching it again, slower this time. His eyes flickered back and forth, studying every detail. The way Williams hesitated, the way Marshall never once looked up. He sat back, the chair creaking under his weight. Pieces were beginning to fall into place, jagged edges that hinted at something far deeper than a simple disappearance. Lane picked up his phone, dialing the church's office. It rang twice before a soft voice answered. "This is Grace Baptist." "This is Detective Lane," he said firmly. "I need access to your financial records. All of them." A pause, and then, "Under whose authority?" "Under the authority of the 2 bodies you just dug out of your basement," he replied, voice steely. "I'll be there in an hour." He hung up and stared at the frozen image on the screen. The pastor, shoulders hunched under the weight of whatever he carried, vanishing into the shadows beneath the church he swore to protect. The walls of Grace Baptist seemed to close in tighter as Detective Lane walked through the front doors, his footsteps echoing off the polished floors. The secretary, a thin woman with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetual frown, watched him from behind her desk, her hands folded neatly atop a stack of hymnals. "Pastor Williams isn't in right now," she said quickly, her voice thin and reedy. "I'm not here for him," Lane replied, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "I'm here for the financial records." Her frown deepened, the lines around her mouth etching deeper. "I'm not sure I understand," she began, but Lane had already stepped past her, his hand resting on the handle of the office door labeled Church Administration. He paused, turning back to her with a look that was both patient and implacable. "You can unlock this for me, or I can call for a warrant. Your choice." She faltered, eyes darting back and forth before nodding slowly. With trembling fingers, she pulled a ring of keys from her drawer, shuffling through them before fitting the correct one into the lock. The door swung open with a low creak, and Lane stepped inside. The room was small and cluttered, papers stacked high on every surface, file cabinets crammed so tightly that their drawers bulged. The smell of dust and stale coffee clung to the air. Lane wasted no time, slipping on a pair of gloves and pulling open the nearest drawer. It screeched in protest, revealing rows of manila folders labeled with dates and department names. He worked methodically, setting each folder down and flipping through the contents. Most were mundane: invoices for repairs, payroll for the small church staff, electric bills, and charity fund logs. But near the back, nestled between thicker files, he found it, a thin folder marked Special Projects Fund. Lane laid it out on the desk, spreading the contents across the surface. Receipts and withdrawal slips fluttered out, dated over the course of 6 months, exactly 5 years ago. Each withdrawal was neatly catalogued, signed by both Deacon Marshall and Sarah Williams. $200,000, gone in steady increments. For special projects. But there were no records of any special projects, no renovations, no new community programs. Just the slow siphoning of funds into accounts that didn't seem to exist. Lane's eyes scanned the signatures, the tight loop of Sarah's cursive, the sharp slant of Marshall's initials. It was all perfectly neat, perfectly legal on paper. But it reeked of something rotten. The secretary hovered in the doorway, wringing her hands. I didn't know, she stammered. I just filed them. I never thought. Lane turned to face her, folding the papers back into the folder. Did you see much of Deacon Marshall in those days? Around the time Sarah disappeared? She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. Not really. He stopped coming around about a month before she went missing. I asked Pastor Williams, but he said Marshall was taking a break. That they had differences of opinion. Differences of opinion? Lane repeated, arching a brow. She nodded. That's what he said. Something about church finances. I don't know more than that. Lane tucked the folder under his arm, offering her a nod. You've been very helpful, he said smoothly. I'm sure I'll have more questions soon. She swallowed, her hands shaking slightly as she watched him leave. Outside, the sun had slipped behind a bank of clouds, casting long shadows across the pavement. Lane slid into his car, the manila folder resting on the passenger seat beside him. He sat for a long moment, eyes fixed on the towering shape of Grace Baptist, its steeple piercing the sky like a blade. $200,000. Special projects. And 2 bodies buried under the church, entwined in death like lovers in a final embrace. Lane started the car, his mind set. It was time to have another chat with Pastor Williams. Detective Lane's sedan rolled to a stop just outside the wrought iron gates of the parsonage. The house was modest, neatly tucked behind the church grounds, its windows framed with heavy curtains that blocked out prying eyes. A garden stretched along the side of the house, wilted from neglect, with patches of wild grass creeping up through the cobblestone path that led to the front door. Lane stepped out of the car, his shoes crunching on the gravel as he approached. He knocked twice, the sound echoing off the wooden frame. Silence. He knocked again, louder this time, and after a long pause, the door swung open. Pastor Williams stood in the entryway, his eyes shadowed and rimmed red, as if sleep had been a distant memory. He looked thinner than Lane remembered, his shirt buttoned hastily, one collar slightly askew. "Detective," he greeted, voice tight. Is there something new?" Lane didn't miss the flicker of unease that darted across the pastor's eyes. "There is actually," he replied, holding up the manila folder for emphasis. "Mind if I come in?" Williams hesitated, his hands still gripping the edge of the door. His eyes flicked over Lane's shoulder, scanning the empty driveway before he nodded and stepped back. "Of course," he murmured, his voice brittle. The interior of the parsonage was sparse but well-kept, hardwood floors polished to a shine, walls lined with framed scripture, a single cross mounted above the mantel. Lane followed Pastor Williams into the small living room, his gaze sweeping over the space, noting the lack of clutter. It felt like a place prepared for visitors, scrubbed clean of personal touches. A museum of faith and modesty. Williams gestured for him to sit, settling stiffly in the armchair across from Lane, his hands folded neatly in his lap. "What can I help you with, detective?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. Lane leaned forward, placing the folder on the coffee table between them. "I wanted to go over a few things with you," he began, flipping it open. "The church's finances, for one." Williams' expression didn't change, but his hands tightened slightly in his lap. "Our finances?" "That's right." Lane pulled out a sheet of withdrawal slips, laying them out side by side. $200,000. Taken out in small amounts over 6 months. All marked for special projects. He looked up, meeting Williams' gaze head-on. "What were those projects, exactly?" Pastor Williams cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his chair. We were planning renovations," he replied, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "Expanding the food pantry, repairing the roof. I wanted to make sure we had enough before we started." "Odd," Lane mused, tapping one of the slips. "Because there are no records of material purchases. No invoices. No signed contracts." He leaned back, letting the silence settle between them. "It's almost like the money just disappeared." Pastor Williams swallowed, the sound sharp in the quiet room. I don't handle the finances directly," he murmured. "That was mostly Deacon Marshall's responsibility." Lane's eyes didn't waver. "And Sarah's, right? I mean, she was a co-signer on the account." The pastor flinched at her name, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Yes," he whispered. "She helped with the books." "Funny," Lane continued, his tone sharp and smooth. "I spoke to Mrs. Lattimore. She remembers Sarah and Deacon Marshall spending a lot of time together." Working on those special projects, I suppose. He leaned forward, voice lowering to a near whisper. You wouldn't happen to know what they were working on, would you? Pastor Williams' eyes snapped back up, flaring with something raw and unguarded. I told you, he said, his voice trembling slightly. I don't know. Lane watched him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch, listening to the distant hum of the refrigerator in the next room, the soft ticking of a clock on the mantel. I think you do, he replied finally, his voice steady. And I think we're going to find out soon enough. Pastor Williams didn't answer. His eyes had fallen back to his hands, fingers clasped so tightly his knuckles shone white. Lane stood, gathering the papers back into the folder. I'll be in touch, he said simply, his gaze never leaving the pastor's. He stepped out of the parsonage, the door clicking shut behind him, the sound heavy and final. Outside, the sun had dipped below the treetops, casting long shadows across the path back to his car. Detective Lane slid into the driver's seat, his fingers tapping the steering wheel in thought. He had shaken something loose back there, something that had been buried for 5 long years. And soon, he knew, it would all come spilling out. The air was heavy with tension as Detective Lane walked back into the precinct, his footsteps echoing off the linoleum floors. The manila folder sat under his arm like a secret barely contained, its edges crumpled from his grip. He navigated the maze of desks, nodding curtly to passing colleagues before settling into his chair. His mind buzzed with questions, each one snagging on the next, forming a tangled web that stretched back 5 long years. He spread the contents of the folder across his desk, financial records, photocopies of church documents, and the grainy stills from the surveillance footage. He had printed them off that morning, each frame captured in ghostly black and white. Pastor Williams and Deacon Marshall, carrying heavy garbage bags into the church basement. One coming back, one disappearing into the shadows. Lane stared at the images, his finger tracing the outline of Pastor Williams' form. The pastor's face was blurred, the camera too old to capture more than smudges and shadows. But it was him. It had to be. The height, the build, everything matched. He shuffled through the papers again, searching for something he knew was there but couldn't yet see. His instincts, sharp and honed by years of practice, whispered that the answers were just out of reach. A knock on his desk broke his concentration. Lane looked up to see Officer Greer, his rookie partner, hovering with an awkward smile. Got something for you, Detective, Greer said, holding out a stack of files. Background checks on Pastor Williams and Deacon Marshall. Thought you might want to take a look. Lane accepted the files with a nod. Good work, Greer, he replied, already flipping through the pages. Greer lingered for a moment, his eyes flicking to the surveillance photos. That from the church? He asked. Yeah, Lane replied, not looking up. It's from the night Sarah disappeared. Greer whistled low. They were moving something big. Yeah, Lane echoed, his voice taut with tension. Something real big. He returned his focus to the files, flipping through Deacon Marshall's first. Bank statements, mortgage records, tax filings. All normal, save for the last 6 months before his disappearance. Deposits of $5,000, $10,000, sometimes more. The origin was listed simply as GBC General Fund Transfer. Lane's pen scratched notes in the margin, his mind racing. The second file was thinner. Pastor Williams' financials were neat, almost obsessively so. Mortgage paid on time, tithes calculated to the dollar, no outstanding debts. But something nagged at Lane, an oddity tucked between the lines of financial propriety. Williams had taken out a life insurance policy on Sarah 2 years before she disappeared. A hefty one. $500,000, payable upon confirmation of death. Lane's hand paused, the pen hovering above the page. He set the file down carefully, his gaze settling back on the surveillance photos. Pastor Williams, carrying bags into the basement with Deacon Marshall. And then only one man coming back. He flipped open his notebook, scribbling a list of names. People to interview, Sarah's family, Deacon Marshall's widow, members of the church who might have seen something and hadn't yet realized its importance. He tapped his pen against the notebook's edge, his eyes narrowing. He needed more. He needed proof. Lane stood abruptly, shoving the papers back into the folder and grabbing his jacket from the back of the chair. Greer straightened, eyebrows raised. You going somewhere? Lane nodded, slipping his arms into his coat. I'm going to pay another visit to Grace Baptist. Greer opened his mouth as if to ask more, but Lane was already moving, the door swinging shut behind him. Outside, the rain had started to fall again, a slow drizzle that misted the windows and slicked the streets. Lane slid into his car, the engine rumbling to life as he pulled away from the curb. There were secrets buried at Grace Baptist. Secrets that had been hidden in plain sight, cloaked in scripture and sanctity. But Lane was beginning to see through the veil, the cracks widening with each new discovery. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his eyes locked on the road ahead. It was time to peel back the layers. The rain came down harder as Detective Lane pulled into the gravel lot beside Grace Baptist Church. The spire rose against the gray sky, its shadow stretching long across the pavement like a finger pointing back toward judgment. Lane stepped out of the car, the wind whipping the rain sideways, slicking his coat as he approached the church doors. They were locked, as expected. Sunday service wasn't until tomorrow, and the building sat silent and dark. Lane walked the perimeter, his footsteps muted by the rain-slicked gravel. He stopped at the side entrance, the same one from the surveillance footage. The hinges were rusted, the paint chipped and flaking. He reached out, testing the handle. It turned easily. Unlocked. He pushed the door open, stepping inside and pulling it shut behind him. The hallway stretched out before him, dimly lit by narrow windows clouded with grime. His footsteps echoed as he moved through the corridor, passing doors marked with wooden plaques. Pastor's study, nursery, fellowship hall. At the far end, a stairwell led down into the basement, its steel door slightly ajar. Lane hesitated for just a moment before descending, the light growing dimmer with each step. The basement was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of dust and something metallic that lingered just beneath it. The concrete floor was cracked in places, old paint peeling from the walls in jagged strips. Lane pulled out his flashlight, its beam cutting through the shadows, illuminating rows of folding chairs stacked neatly along the wall. To his left, an old storage room loomed, its door slightly cracked. He moved closer, nudging the door open with his shoulder. Inside, boxes were piled high, some labeled with dates, others simply marked donations. Lane's beam swept the room, catching glimmers of dust swirling in the air. He stepped in, brushing aside a stack of hymnals that had toppled over, and made his way toward the back. It was there, half hidden behind a broken filing cabinet, that he saw it. A patch of concrete in the far corner, newer than the rest of the floor, smoother, less cracked. Lane knelt down, running his fingers over the surface. It was different. No dust, no wear, as if it had been poured long after the rest of the basement had settled into its age. He stood slowly, his breath fogging in the chill of the room. He stepped back, his eyes tracing the boundaries of the fresh cement. The shape was roughly rectangular, about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. A shiver ran down his spine. He pulled out his phone, snapping pictures from every angle before stepping back into the hallway. Lane climbed the stairs, his mind racing. If this was what he thought it was, then the 2 bodies in the basement might not be the end of it. He pushed through the doors, back into the main hall, the stained glass windows casting fractured light across the floor. He made his way back to the sanctuary, the silence thick and heavy. The pulpit stood at the center of it all, towering and solid. Lane approached it slowly, his hand brushing the wooden surface. The platform was raised, elevated above the congregation, built to command attention and respect. But as Lane's eyes swept the area, he noticed something peculiar, a faint seam running along the edge of the platform, barely visible under the carpet's edge. He crouched, fingers prying gently, lifting the corner just enough to confirm his suspicion. The platform was hollow. He stood, heart thumping in his chest, the rain pattering against the stained glass like a whisper. Secrets buried under the pulpit. Fresh concrete in the basement. And 2 people missing for 5 long years. Lane backed away slowly, slipping out through the same side door he had entered. He stepped back into the rain, pulling his collar up against the chill. There was more beneath Grace Baptist than just bodies. He was certain of it now. And whatever it was waiting to be unearthed. The courtroom was packed to the walls, the air thick with anticipation. Rows of spectators filled the wooden benches, their whispers crackling like static under the fluorescent lights. Reporters lined the back wall, their notepads poised and cameras ready, waiting to catch every flicker of emotion, every crack in the facade of the man now seated at the defendant's table, Pastor David Williams. He wore a dark suit, neatly pressed, with a crimson tie knotted perfectly at his throat. His hands were folded neatly on the table, his eyes forward, fixed on the judge's bench with a calmness that belied the storm swirling around him. Detective Lane sat just a few rows back, arms crossed, expression steeled. His eyes never left the pastor's face. It had all unraveled so quickly. The search warrant had been issued just days after Lane's discovery of the hollow space beneath the pulpit. A team of forensic investigators swept the church, prying back layers of carpet and splintering through wooden beams. What they found was exactly what Lane had suspected: an opening, a crawl space just big enough to hold two bodies, tightly wrapped and bound in layers of plastic sheeting. The remains were brittle, the smell of decay long faded, but the forensic team had no trouble identifying them. Deacon Marshall and Sarah Williams, both found curled together beneath the place where Pastor Williams had preached redemption and salvation for half a decade. Their hands were bound, their skulls fractured with the telltale signs of blunt force trauma. It was clean, calculated, but the evidence was undeniable. The courtroom fell silent as the judge entered, her robe swaying as she took her seat. "This court is now in session," she declared, her voice ringing out with authority. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman in a gray suit, stood and began her opening statement. She painted a vivid picture of greed and betrayal. Two lovers planning their escape with stolen church funds, a pastor left behind to face the shame and ruin of their abandonment. And so he took matters into his own hands. Lane watched as the evidence was paraded before the jury. The financial records showing the secret transfers, the surveillance footage of Williams and Marshall moving those heavy bags into the basement, and finally, the chilling discovery of their bodies beneath the pulpit. But it was the confession that broke the case wide open. When confronted with the evidence, Pastor Williams had sat back in his chair at the precinct, his eyes hollow and his hands folded neatly on the table. He spoke with the same measured calmness he had from the pulpit. "They were planning to leave," he had said, his voice eerily steady, "with my wife and the church's money." He recounted the night with chilling detail, how he had followed them, confronted them in the basement where they thought no one would find them, how the argument had escalated, how the blows had come, swift and unyielding, and finally, how he and Deacon Marshall had carried Sarah's body into the basement, only for the pastor to turn on his accomplice moments later. "And you buried them under your own church?" Detective Lane had asked, his voice tight with disbelief. Pastor Williams had smiled then, a strange, distant expression. "Seemed fitting," he had replied. "They wanted to lie together. So I let them." Now, in the courtroom, the jury sat motionless, their faces pale with the weight of his words. The prosecutor paced in front of them, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "He buried them under the very pulpit where he preached forgiveness and grace," she declared, her voice rising with conviction. "He lied to his congregation, he lied to his community, and he lied to God." There was a pause, the room heavy with silence. And then she turned to the jury, her eyes hard and unyielding. "But the truth," she said softly, "the truth always comes to light." Lane leaned back in his seat, his gaze still fixed on Pastor Williams. For the first time, the pastor's hands trembled slightly, the knuckles paling under the strain. Lane allowed himself the smallest flicker of satisfaction. Grace Baptist Church stood silent under the slate-gray sky, its white steeple piercing the heavens as if reaching for redemption. But the air around it had changed. Congregants still arrived on Sunday mornings, still clasped their hands in prayer, still bowed their heads in reverence, but something lingered now, a shadow stretching long and unyielding. Whispers filled the quiet moments before service, glances exchanged over hymnals and folded hands. There were things left unspoken, things too heavy to bear but impossible to forget. Detective Lane watched it all unfold from a distance, his visits to the neighborhood now less frequent, but always deliberate. He had seen it before, the slow unraveling of trust, the way secrets clung to walls like damp rot, spreading quietly until the foundations themselves began to crumble. Grace Baptist, for all its whitewashed walls and gleaming windows, would never truly be the same. But there were small mercies. The money, nearly all of it, had been recovered after weeks of sifting through forged documents and dummy accounts. Deacon Marshall had stashed it away under false names, hidden in safety deposit boxes that no one had thought to question. When the funds were returned to the church, there had been a brief flicker of hope, a promise that the community could heal, rebuild, find faith again. Pastor Williams, however, would find no redemption. His sentence was upheld, appeals denied with the efficiency of a system that had seen too many like him. He was transferred to a maximum security facility upstate, his days now spent in the solitude of a concrete cell. No sermons, no pulpit, just silence. His congregation moved on slowly, hesitantly, like a flock that had lost its shepherd but not its faith. Lane visited him once, weeks after the trial, curiosity tugging him back to the man who had once commanded a community with the power of his words. The room had been stark and bare, the walls thick with layers of chipped paint. Pastor Williams sat on the other side of the glass, hands folded neatly in his lap, eyes still sharp but tempered now with something darker, acceptance, perhaps. Or maybe resignation. They had spoken little. Lane had asked about the money, about the bodies, about what it felt like to preach every Sunday over the very graves of those he had condemned. Williams had only smiled, a sad, knowing twist of his lips. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he had replied simply, his voice steady and unyielding. Lane had left with a heaviness in his chest, the echo of Williams' words lingering long after the prison gates had clanged shut behind him. Now, as Lane stood at the edge of the church grounds, watching the congregants spill out into the sunlight after service, he felt that same weight settle over him. They were trying to rebuild. He could see it in the way they clasped hands, the way they whispered promises of better days to come. But scars like those didn't fade easily. As he turned to leave, his eyes caught on the plaque mounted near the entrance, in loving memory of Sarah Williams and Deacon Marshall. Gone, but never forgotten. Beneath it, fresh flowers had been placed, their petals bright and defiant against the gray stone. Lane paused, his hand brushing the edge of the marble, feeling the coolness seep into his fingertips. "Never forgotten," he murmured, stepping back onto the sidewalk, the shadows stretching long behind him. He walked away slowly, his footsteps echoing against the pavement, the whispers of the congregation fading into the distance. Justice had been served, but peace was still a distant thing. If this story moved you, if it made you question what lies beneath the surface of trust and faith, then join us. There are countless stories like this, hidden in the corners of everyday life, waiting to be uncovered. Stories of betrayal, redemption, and the relentless search for truth. Hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell to follow every twist, every revelation, and every step towards justice. Because sometimes the truth isn't buried, it's hidden in plain sight.